Oh, thanks. Thanks very much, Scott. I think that there are two people in this room who work at the Canadian Constitution Foundation with me, so who know a lot about Bruce's case, and one of them is in fact Bruce's lawyer, Derek Frum, who's sitting right there. So I feel like it's useful to point you guys out, in part just to say that if I feel free to jump in if I'm missing details, or if Derek, if you've got an anecdote about actually being there on this case, then let's make this even more of a personal presentation. Having said that as well, because we've got a fairly small group, please don't hesitate at any point to just jump in with questions. I do have a story that I want to tell you about Bruce and Donna Montague, and I do want to talk to you about civil forfeiture and a little bit about criminal forfeiture, which form the basis for their story. But I also don't have any problem with going off and doing a little bit of discussion. And if you get out of line, Scott is going to cut you off. So I have every confidence in him. So these are the real Montagues. This is the Montague family. Bruce and Donna are a couple. They live in northwestern Ontario. Those are their 3 kids. This is actually quite an old photo. We could use a newer one because Bruce and Donna's kids are grown now. Katie, who's the little girl in this picture, is now a grown woman who's expecting a baby any day now. The Montagues will be grandparents. And the two sons have become a doctor and a priest, respectively. So everyone, they're empty nesters now, but that is their home, and that's what we're going to be talking a lot about. The Montagues are clients of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, which, in case you don't know about it, is where Derek Heron and I work, and we represent Canadians whose constitutional rights are being infringed by government. One of our areas is property rights, and that's why we're involved with Bruce and Donna. And Bruce and Donna's property is the log home that you see right there in the background. Now, this story begins probably around 1995. Bruce was a gunsmith in northwestern Ontario. Bruce and Donna both had some real principled objections to the changes in Canada's gun registration and licensing laws in the 90s. And Bruce did a lot of protesting about these changes to the laws, which he felt were unconstitutional. So he protested on Parliament, he went around and did speaking tours, he formed groups. Eventually, what he decided to do was to express his dissatisfaction with the laws and his feelings that they were unconstitutional in a more public way. So what he did was he purposely and very publicly let his gun licenses expire, as well as his business license as a gunsmith. Just to give you a little bit of context, Bruce was a very well-respected member of his community, and he was so respected as a gunsmith that local law enforcement often used him for their own firearms and would go to him. So just to give you context that we're not dealing with a scofflaw who was, in the habit of breaking laws and or was distrusted. This act of letting the license expire was something that he did really as a sort of public, obvious protest. And I think what Bruce's hope was at the time was that this would give him an opportunity to challenge the gun laws, which he did not think were constitutional, and have his day in court. So he got half of his wish. He did get his day in court. He was arrested, charged. Unfortunately, though, his arguments did not convince the court, so he was convicted of the offenses for letting the licenses expire. This is a summary of his conviction. He was sentenced to 18 months in jail and 90 days community imprisonment, followed by a year of probation. It might sound a bit harsh for somebody who only committed paper crimes and who didn't hurt anybody and really was not enriched by his crime, but this is what it was. And believe it or not, this is by far the best part of the story, or the most reasonable part of the sentence, if you ask me. Bruce, at this point, did serve his time in jail. He served about 7 months. No one would want to be in that position, but I think it's fair to say that he probably handled it as well as anybody could. He tutored other inmates. He would help with repairing things at the jail because he's a very handy person, and did his time, came home. Very hard on the family, as you can imagine, but that's done. This is the second part of the price that Bruce paid for his crimes. And this is the part where the Canadian Constitution Foundation gets involved, and this is the part where property rights get involved. Bruce was not only sentenced to do this jail time. Even after all that was done and he had done his time and he had come home, the government was not satisfied. What the government then said is that, well, for one thing, Bruce was prohibited from owning firearms and continuing his business. But for another thing, the federal government used criminal forfeiture laws to seize Bruce's firearms collection. So this is not just a few firearms here and there. This was a large collection that included mementos from Bruce and Donna's family. It included Bruce's business inventory, and it's worth about $100,000. So very valuable. And in the meantime, the Ontario government said, well, we'd also like some of your stuff. So the Ontario government went after that very same collection using civil forfeiture laws, as well as Bruce and Donna's house. Now, this is the part in the story where I usually get people saying, wait, I got all the rest of it, but what does the house have to do with it? I thought this was a crime about licenses expiring, and it is. And it's a very good question. How the heck did we get to the house? And the way we got to the house is that we have what we at the CCF think are very flawed civil forfeiture laws in much of the country and in Ontario, which does allow the government to say, the very fact that you've been convicted allows us to say, we're going to take your home and we're going to sell it for cash and we are going to keep that cash. Okay, yeah, right, call this slide, wait, how can they take his house? So specifically what the government says is that the house is a proceed or instrument of unlawful activity. This is a pretty interesting thing to say in Bruce's case. It's part of the legislation because that's what the criminal forfeiture law says. But if you look at what happened with Bruce and Donna, proceed of unlawful activity. There clearly were no proceeds of this unlawful activity. Nobody made any money off of Bruce protesting by letting his licenses expire, certainly not Bruce. The only one who actually stands to make any money in this case is the government if they succeed in the forfeitures. Instrument of unlawful activity. This is where the government says, well, Bruce operated his gunsmithing business out of his home. So there you go. That's how we got there. So they're saying the home is an instrument of the unlawful activity that we're talking about. So we're justified in taking this house. This strikes most people and me as completely disproportionate to the crime that was committed. It's also very disturbing because, as you can imagine, anything that is connected, anything where you had a physical presence can be deemed an instrument of unlawful activity, even if it's something that is not going to help you conduct more criminal activity. It's hard to see what purpose this serves. It's certainly not going to make anybody safer. It is going to give the government a little bit more in their coffers. I have here a video of Katie Montague, who's Bruce and Donna's daughter, talking a little bit about the house that the Ontario government is trying to take. And that reminded me that I'm really obviously a PowerPoint novice because I forgot about the fact that we don't have any speakers in here. So I was going to play this video and be like, oh, wow, interactive. I think I won't because we only have the speakers on the laptop. But I'll just give you some details. What this video, you can take my word for it, is Katie made this video early on when it became clear that the Ontario government was trying to seize the home. And it really gives you a good idea of why taking somebody's house it becomes even more personal and gutting even than any fine you could imagine. So this is a house that, as I said, you can see it's quite beautiful. Bruce built it literally with his own hands. Katie was a little thing about this high at the time, and there are pictures of her helping strip the logs, and some of the logs that she stripped as a little girl went in her own bedroom. So I mean, it was literally the fruits of the family's labor. And the kids grew up there. So this is where Katie lived, where the two sons lived. Bruce and Donna still live there. And in addition to the gun collection that we talked about before, this forms all of their assets. There's nothing more. Because Bruce can't work as a gunsmith anymore, they really are living on Donna's income, which is limited, and this is all they've got. So the point of this video was really just to drive home what I think we all know in our guts and hearts, which is that when somebody takes your home, it's more than just the value of that house, which actually is considerable. It's also really taking a huge part of your life. So that's why the Canadian Constitution Foundation has gotten involved in Bruce's case. We see a real constitutional problem with what the government has done with the 2 forfeitures, and we also just see a person a responsible individual whose life is actually being ruined by government for reasons that go beyond government's legitimate powers. A lot of people who hear about Bruce's case want to know, okay, wait, is this really happening now? I mean, I've been hearing about this for years. This case has been going on for about a decade. Hasn't it gone away? So I do want to just make sure that everybody understands where we are and what we're doing. As I said, there are 2 parts to this. The federal government went after the firearms collection. That is worth about $100,000. The Canadian Constitution Foundation, and this is where Derek was Bruce's lawyer, represented Bruce and Donna in a case at the Federal Court of Appeal. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Oh, can't change. Anyway, it's not the Federal Court of Appeal, the Ontario Court of Appeal. And unfortunately, we lost that case, and we've now asked the Supreme Court of Canada for leave to appeal to them. So we're waiting for all of that. In the meantime, Ontario, in the civil suit, is waiting to see what happens in the criminal suit. I mean, in part, they can't go ahead because they want some of the same spoils. So they still want the same guns that are at issue in the criminal suit. So Bruce really has 2 hurdles to get through. We have to wait and hear whether the Supreme Court will hear this case, which we very much hope they will, because we think it's an extremely important constitutional principle at stake, and we want to know whether other Canadians have to worry about having their property seized in the same way without getting a chance to properly defend themselves and in a way that really is not necessarily proportionate to any crime that was committed. The interesting thing, I think, when you look at these 2 forfeiture actions, one thing that's interesting is even the federal government didn't opt to go after the house, which I think underlines really how unnecessary that part of the civil forfeiture is. And you can look at the gun collection, you could say, well, perhaps there's an argument there. I understand the forfeiture because maybe it's a safety issue. I could then say to you, well, Derek made a very good point in our arguments that the government could take the gun collection, sell it, and give the proceeds back to Bruce instead of keeping it for themselves, and there you go, any safety issue you think is there is solved. But even setting that aside, there's at least a little bit more of a connection there, I believe, than with the house, where the house, it really screams out saying, this looks like a cash grab, because what other reason is there for the government to be taking this house? The other thing about the house is that what happened to Bruce and Donna with the house happens to a lot of people who are who experience attempts by the government to take their homes or property by forfeiture. And what happened is that the government came to them and said, look, we will give you $50,000, you give us, making a mistake, you give us, the government, $50,000, which is, Bruce's house is worth over $300,000, we believe. If you give us $50,000 and sign a gag order so that you don't tell anybody about it, we'll go away. Now, Bruce happens to be a very principled and perhaps even stubborn person. And Bruce...
Is this the Ontario or the federal?
This is the Ontario. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a bit confusing. And so this is the Ontario government. And Bruce and Donna didn't take the deal. But if you think about it, I think most people would, because this was an opportunity to save $250,000, have the government go away, not have to pay lawyers anymore, and just be done with it. And the unfortunate thing is that we don't even know how many people are getting offered these deals and taking them, because the government does not make that information public, and that's the point of the gag order. These people remain silent because they have to, and we're unable to even tally up the amounts of times that this has happened. We're trying, and Karen and others in our organization are trying to, through freedom of information requests and other ways of searching, trying to figure it out. But I really believe that this is one of the reasons that there isn't more understanding and outrage about these procedures, because we just don't know how often they're going on and how often they're happening. So that's where the Montagues are now. We are going to do our utmost to save Bruce and Donna's home. We had a really strong brief into the Supreme Court as far as trying to get a case heard about the gun collection as well. So I don't want to be too much of a downer or too pessimistic, because I feel like we have a very strong case. But I think you need to know that the cards are really stacked in the government's favor in Bruce and Donna's case and in any other forfeiture cases. In civil forfeiture in particular, the government only has to meet a balance of probabilities test. So you know that you hear over and over again on Law and Order and on TV and in movies and of course in real life, in a criminal trial the government has to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's for our protection, because we want to think that if you're going to be punished in a severe way, if your liberty is going to be taken away, the government should have to be sure, and the judge or jury should have to be sure. That's what the reasonable doubt standard is there for. In these civil forfeiture cases, they're considered something minor, like a little fine. It's not a criminal penalty. So it's only this balance of probabilities test, which is less than 51%. That is really low standard when you're talking about taking away somebody's entire life savings or somebody's home, or in this case, both. There's no presumption of innocence, which is sort of the same way of saying the same thing, but it's the phrase that we're used to hearing in this context. And again, when you're dealing with something as important as this really does give the government a huge advantage. And not having that reasonable doubt standard puts you at a disadvantage. For Derek, who's Bruce's lawyer, has to work that much harder. Yeah.
Are there no safeguards in regard to the government having to live up to a proportionate standard, as this is the home of these people? And are there no, I'm not familiar with Canadian law, but are there no safeguards in that aspect that would be adjudicated?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, and Derek has had the experience of trying to adjudicate it. So there are and there aren't, and part of that is what we're arguing about, because there is a standard that you cannot, I mean, there's a constitutional guarantee against cruel and unusual punishment, and part of that guarantee comes into the question of whether your punishment is proportionate to your crime. So yeah, if you have these paper crimes, is it proportionate to then take away $400,000 worth of property? We think it's not, and that's part of what we're arguing. And part of what we're arguing also is that the government in these cases is not using the test properly, that they are not looking at this and looking at the individual circumstances the way they should. And the case law around the country has been scattered. So some courts have actually done what you said and looked at it and said, no, based on the size of this crime, this is too much of a punishment. Some courts have said it doesn't matter. And unfortunately, Bruce's case was one where they said, no, it doesn't matter. The fact that it was $100,000 worth, it's just, he committed the crime, so that's it. And that's part of what we're saying needs to be looked at again. And it's something that the Supreme Court of Canada has never looked at in this context, which is why, even though it's always very, very difficult to get the High Court to hear a case and probabilities are low, we're hoping that they might for that reason. But anyway, I think you hit the nail on the head there, because as far as basic fairness goes, in addition to the constitutional protections that exist, that's exactly what you want courts to be asking and looking at.
Just to stay clear, is it only in criminal forfeiture that this test applies, or is it in civil forfeiture as well?
Well, that's also part of what we're arguing too. We also have to argue that we should actually be able they should have to prove the proportionality on the civil side as well. And the government would say, no, we don't. In fact, the government even, Derek had a victory in the previous case, because on the criminal side, the government even said, not only do we not have to prove proportionality, you don't even get to appeal this. You don't even get to ask about it. And Derek convinced them that actually, no, you do. And the judge said, yes, you do get to appeal it. And this is significant enough that you can go that next route. So we've got to keep pushing on both those fronts.
You
U.S.?
Yeah.
Yes. Was it?
It is, and in fact, Karen has, I don't get into it very much in this presentation, but on another occasion, you'll have to hear Karen speak, because Karen has a really good presentation about how this evolved, and it does start, you're absolutely right, from the RICO statutes. Yeah. So to come back to a sort of optimistic view on Bruce's case, this gets back to what we were just saying. The reason we do think Bruce still has a chance is because the punishment really is out of all reasonable proportion to what he did. And so on the criminal side, we've then got that charter argument to say you got to look at the proportionality. And on the civil side, it is still being hashed out what argument should be used and what test should be used, and are these penalties, if they're so severe, is it actually inappropriate to be using this standard, and would it be more appropriate to be using the standard that you use in a criminal case? And I think there's a very good argument to be made that there is. You certainly are losing a lot more here than you often lose in many criminal cases, and we can talk a little bit more also about just how easy it is for government to use these statutes, not only in cases like Bruce's where there was a crime committed, but even on other cases where there wasn't. So this is a little bit about the history of where this all started, and this is research that most of this comes from Karen, actually, because Karen has done presentations and research on this area. So I want to give Karen full credit for that. And as I said, I'm not going to go back into the whole history and as far as the origins, but for Canada, civil forfeiture basically started for Ontario in 2001 and British Columbia in 2005. And we have seen over the fairly short time that this has been around, we have seen the use ramped up, the amount that's been recovered, or well, it's not recovered, the amount that has been seized through these laws has been very high. And they've also provided the basis for other provincial programs to the degree now where if you go around and look around the country, you're going to see similar legislation. Some of it's better, some of it's worse, but the same idea. So that we're fairly close to what you see in the United States, which is where the inspiration came from. And I guess just to bridge into this part of the conversation, I think that's another reason that Bruce and Donna's story is so important. We're still waiting for the ending, and we're still fighting for a good, happy ending, and we'll continue to do so. But part of the reason this is really important is not just because it's an incredible injustice for Bruce and Donna and their beautiful photogenic family. It's a potential injustice for many, many more Canadians. And people tend to think of these forfeiture statutes, particularly the civil forfeiture statutes, as being fairly benign because they're often sold to us as being about taking the property of big drug dealers, kingpins, taking their speedboats, or taking the Ferraris of, I was going to say gangsters. I don't know if the gangsters drive Ferraris, but you get the idea. It's supposed to be to get the worst of the worst, the bad guys who are just sort of living high off the proceeds of their crime. So easy to sell to the public. But it's very important to take a look at who actually is getting caught up in the web of these laws, and the fact that they don't really offer protections that would ensure that it's only the worst of the worst, and that people like Bruce or people who have not even committed a crime don't get caught up. That's why another reason that the Canadian Constitution Foundation is involved in this, because setting a precedent here would not only save Bruce and Donna, it would mean that there would be a whole other class of people, of all of us, who would not have to worry about the government encroachment in that way. This slide also is just saying that there's more. Everyone except Newfoundland and PEI now have civil forfeiture legislation in place. They all got civil forfeiture offices. Like any other laws, once you start, then the whole apparatus gets built up, and there are more and more people who are invested in keeping these in place. So there are, in Bruce's case, for example, in Ontario, there's an entire portion of the Attorney General's office. There's an entire portion of government lawyers who only do civil forfeiture. So this is how it gets entrenched and how it grows, and we've seen that across the country. this slide also just points out that BC and Ontario are probably the worst programs as far as their reach and their lack of protections. Although BC's program has been slightly scaled back by courts in recent times, which again is a little bit encouraging for Bruce's case and for us. Okay, we talked before about the fact that this is a lot of money that they're taking in. So it's not a question of this just being something that's getting used once in a while and it's not a big deal. We're talking about a lot of money that's going into the Attorney General's coffers and then being distributed in ways that Karen has done great research on finding out, which will disturb you. BC's Civil Forfeiture Office had brought in $41 million in total since January of 2014. Ontario, about $37 million. The only silver lining I can see in that is that Ontario's program was around longer. So at least I'm from Ontario, at least we didn't get quite as aggressive as BC, which I think has been the most aggressive in the country. But really significant amounts we're talking about. Ontario has almost $24.5 million in what they call frozen property that is waiting to be sold off. This is not going away, it's just getting bigger. We have some statistics now about how much they've taken in, about how the money has been used, but they are getting quieter and quieter and quieter about that information. I think they're starting to realize that what they think are great victories are seen by some of us as problems, and they don't want to tell. Yeah?
Do you have any breakdown of what these 24.5 million and the other number, what it consists of? As you said, some civil forfeitures might have proper purpose, but it would be interesting to see the underlying data. Is that something that's available? Or?
Yeah, we've tried to do some research. One of our volunteers has started to try and do some research to find out about where the forfeitures were, what the actual details were, and it's tough. The information is not readily available. I think, Karen, you've said that when you first started, the governments would be willing to talk to you and tell you things now that they've clamped
they
up.
were pretty forthcoming at first, but I've never actually asked that question as to what percentage, which money came from genuine criminals and which money came from people whose houses, their tenant just grew some marijuana in. I've never tried to check that out. My guess is that they know now that a bunch of us are looking into this, and they probably don't even keep deliberate records on that, just so that we can't ask for them.
And it's also,
each individual case would have its records, but you have to know what to ask for in order to get them the answer.
and of course, for them, that classification, there is no distinction. I mean, part of the problem is that there's no distinction between the person who just had a tenant growing marijuana and the person who's a drug kingpin. So, in order to sort of pick those out, you have to do it yourself, because for them, they say, no, these are both people who broke the law, so there's no difference. The volunteer who looked into it for us did find a little bit of information, and there is some of, from what we could see, there was both. I mean, there was a mix. There was property that had been seized from gangs, there was property. The problem is that what we don't know is when the property is, even property that's seized from gangs, what we don't know is whether that was actually, there really were gangs, there really was a crime committed, because it is a low probability, it is a low standard, but we'd love to know more, is the bottom line, and the disturbing thing is that it's getting harder and harder to know more, but we're working on it. Karen, these are just a few quotes that Karen actually had gathered together from her presentation that she's done, but I think it just gives you an idea of sort of the eagerness and the bad incentives that this presents to police and to law enforcement, as far as looking at these forfeitures as an opportunity to gain money for themselves, or to just generally be sort of competing to get more and more cash. So this one, police are eagerly gearing up to seize tens of millions of dollars in cash, homes, cars, boats, and planes. Even sort of looking at it from this point of view is unsettling, because we don't want law enforcement we want them to be out there to enforce the law, but what we don't want this to become is some sort of contest to just kind of get a bunch of goods and pile up on.
Am I correct? That's a 26-year-old headline?
Yeah. That one comes from the time when they were going to bring in the criminal code, the criminal forfeiture part into the criminal code.
No, the police don't really have that much power in lots of ways. You know, it kind of makes me kind of wonder about it because we have rampant theft on roads and you name it. And boy, the police can't do nothing when it comes down to it. And then what really disturbs you is said, well, that one little outfit, you know, they have 9 gangs. They know all of the gang members. Can't touch them. Can't do anything to them. We had 2 quads stolen. The police followed them for 40 kilometers. Couldn't touch them. License plates on them. The whole 9 yards. We said they're stolen quads. They follow them for 40 kilometers and the guys turn off down to the roads and police can't touch them. So it's there's a certain amount of this that's kind of bad. And like when it comes to dealing with big industry, that confidentiality thing is it puts the 2-bit farmer against the multi-billionaires. And the time runs, the clock turns on an old person till you fall off the end of the program. So
Yeah, unfortunately,
there's
in all litigation, it does,
different ways of looking at things,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, you had it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm presuming, I'm a lawyer, but I don't deal with forfeiture.
Mhm.
But I'm presuming that it's tied to a breach of something. So the criminal forfeiture would be related to a breach of the criminal code,
Mhm.
and civil would be to a breach of some civil. Is it?
Well, actually, surprisingly not necessarily. The civil forfeiture, let me see if I have I'll go back to these in a sec, but this is from Ontario's Civil Remedies Act, and it's pretty shocking in a way. So an offense may be found even if no person has been charged or a person was charged but acquitted. So this, to me, is the scariest part of the forfeiture law in Ontario. Bruce's case, I feel, is very strong, but he is convicted of a crime. So as strong as it is, there is that peg. There are many cases in Ontario. There was a recent one that was reported in the paper where there was a couple in a home. The police did a drug raided the house, found drugs, charged them. Then issued a bunch of press releases, the police, because they were very proud of the raid, but then something happened. We don't know what. Police went very quiet, dropped the charges. Great, you'd think it was over, but it wasn't. Ontario then went in and said, well, we're going to take the house. But these people weren't charged. Doesn't matter. The government couldn't prove their case, obviously. They couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt because they wouldn't go to court. Doesn't matter, we're still taking the house. And the interesting and disturbing thing too is that because this is not a criminal charge, these people were not entitled to a lawyer. So there are quotes in the paper from these people saying, well, we wanted to fight, but we couldn't afford to. We don't have the money to go hire a lawyer to actually fight this in court. And the government saying, well, we don't have a responsibility to provide you with a lawyer because this isn't a criminal charge. Yeah.
I don't know, whenever you're finished with your thought, then I just want to say something directly to Gail that I think will answer her question.
Yeah, sure. No, go ahead.
I don't know what the Alberta law says.
I've never
Derek might
looked
know,
at
but
it
the Ontario Act actually just refers to unlawful activities. So that's anything under the criminal code and anything that's a provincial offense as well. So under all Ontario regulatory law, anything that's an offense under Ontario law, and that could be anything from having more than the number of chickens that you're allowed under your chicken quota. Could be all kinds of things.
Yeah, because it's the word unlawful.
Unlawful activity.
Yeah. So what about paramountcy and double jeopardy? Because it seems interesting when you look at the guns. I can criminal code, right? You breach that. You breach 2 business license, the permit for the guns, right? Which goes to that, and then your business license. I can link that in my brain. But it seems to me there'd almost be a paramountcy issue that you can't, and the double jeopardy. So if the guns were related to one thing.
Now, on double jeopardy, there's actually case law, and this worked in our favor in Montague because we're making the constitutional argument that the punishment is unproportioned. There's case law that says that the final punishment is not meted out until all criminal consequences are exhausted. And also the forfeiture in the criminal context is one of those consequences. So that was the court's way of sidestepping double jeopardy, saying, look, there's no double jeopardy, these are all just penal consequences arising out of the same act. And which then worked in our favor, because we could say, look, he went to jail, he did this and happened, and he's losing his firearms collection. It's not double jeopardy. This is so completely out of proportion, you gotta do something about this. So double jeopardy doesn't work where you can't argue against it on the basis of double jeopardy. Now paramountcy, I'm not sure I understand.
Well, the guns, right, that's criminal.
Yeah.
Right? That's federal.
Yeah.
The provincial legislation where they're claiming related to the guns
Yeah.
is provincial, so
Yeah, okay, yeah, I see.
that's where I'm looking at
could,
going.
maybe a National Geographic analogy would help. The federal government is the lion, and they go and they eat their fill. Provincial government are the vultures that come pick the scraps off the bones afterwards.
But I mean,
And
you're
so-
right
But my
that
question is
there's,
the guns, if you're going after the guns,
They're gonna go first though.
They're going to
Feds are
go first to the feds.
right,
And
yeah,
then the
I
province
think I
gets
see what
it,
you're
that
saying. You're
they
saying,
work.
why can the province even touch something based on the federal
exactly,
offense?
that's my,
Because it's a different statute. It's a different standard of proof. If the government doesn't get it at the federal level, it could be because they didn't prove their case.
yeah, like
But
I understand why they'd file a civil remedy at the same time. I understand why they would do that, because they would wait to see what happens with it.
Yeah.
But ultimately, somebody would need to make a decision to say between one gun, who gets it? Right?
Yeah, and it seems that the way it works is the feds get it if they get it first.
Yep.
And then if the feds don't
And
get
then
it,
so the
then-
house thing, they just said, well, just in case all the guns are gone, we're
yeah,
gonna
we'll take the house.
take the house, and they're saying the house because he conducted his business from there, which is kind of scary for farmers, because
Yeah.
you conduct your farm from your farm.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's also proven scary for landlords, as Derek mentioned. There have been, what has happened a lot of times is there are people who are, there's even one case in Ontario, Derek, correct me if I get the details wrong, but it's people who had a rooming house that the whole purpose was to try and help the down and out and give them a place to live. And these landlords then, there's a case where some of the tenants had drugs, and now the government is taking the house from the landlords who were basically trying to do something charitable and good. And because they didn't police it every moment of the day to make sure there weren't drugs, their property would be.
And the interesting thing in that case would be that the landlords are stuck in a hard place because they potentially lose their place because there's drugs and addicts. But at the same time, if they evict these people, they might be subject
That's right,
to human rights
That's
legislation.
right.
So
And
you're damned if you do, damned if you
And it
don't.
certainly discourages anybody else from setting up a charitable place where they're trying to take in down and out people, because you're like, whoa, I could lose
No,
my
I
whole
look at the
property.
Alberta one to see, because the word unlawful is the
In
problem,
Alberta-
because it's so broad that it could be.
In Alberta, it's
Yeah.
illegal. The word is illegal, but then it's defined
Oh, there-
anything that's offense under the federal criminal code or the Narcotics Act. And then there's two more provisions that says it can be any provincial offense that's incorporated by regulation, and I can't remember the last one.
That's kind of problematic.
It is, and then then you start looking for the needle in the haystack, right? And
Yeah.
I think at this point, it has not been incorporated by regulation anywhere else. But just Jonathan Dennis could do it.
Yeah,
I'm not a lawyer, but I do have I don't have the actual act right here. It says Alberta Justice and Solicitor General is right from their office. And what it says is a civil forfeiture, and I find it interesting, the title of the victim's restitution. Interesting spin.
yeah,
Then it does go on to say the civil forfeiture process operates regardless of whether charges are laid or convictions are obtained.
and let's talk about that actually. Let's talk about the victims, because that is another way that this goes under the radar a lot of the time, because it's sold to the public. We're told that, the money that's collected goes, in Ontario they call it a Special Victims Fund. In other provinces, in one way or the other, suggest through the naming and through what they actually say is, well, we're taking this and we're making victims whole, which sounds good. There's problems, many problems though. This is not happening the way they suggest it's happening. For one thing, as we were talking about before, we don't know how many of these crimes are victimless crimes, but at least many of them are. Certainly we know that Bruce and Donna's crime was a victimless crime. There's no victim to give this money to. It's going to go to the Attorney General into this fund. Then we'll go back a little bit to who's actually benefiting from the money. And this is research that Karen has done about where the money goes. And this is really valuable research because now it's getting harder and harder to get these numbers. So Karen's got a breakdown now. These are all unnamed categories. I don't know, in your presentation, do you do a guessing game?
No, not exactly, but
Okay.
the drama as you see what.
Okay, this is a mystery.
unfolds.
You don't know. So this is a breakdown of the millions of dollars, where they went. This is Ontario, right? Okay. So you can see the vast proportion is going, a big amount is going to category 1, 27% category 2, 23% category 3, and then a tiny amount category 4. So we'll reveal, the big reveal, what these categories are. So this is money that has been taken, seized from people under civil forfeiture. Government takes the property, sells it. This is where the money is going. The biggest category, number 1, it's grants to law enforcement agencies. So when you talk to people in Canada about civil forfeiture, sometimes they will say, well, no, I know it's a real problem in the United States because we've heard a lot about civil forfeiture in the United States where the money goes directly to police. And yes, I can see how that's a bad incentive because it's making police try and collect money for their own self-enrichment. But that doesn't happen in Canada. In Canada, it goes to victims. Well, that's not the case. A lot of it is going to law enforcement agencies. Now, I'm not saying they're doing evil things with it, but it's not going to a victim, and we should be clear about that, and the government should be clear about that. And it means that we have the same incentive problem that the United States has, which is that you're asking the same people who are going out and seizing the property, those are the same people who are benefiting from more seizures. The second category I was really surprised about. These are just funds that are remaining in the government account that they don't know what they're going to do with. It's not going to law enforcement. It's not going to victims. It's sitting there. Karen has a theory that one day they're going to slip some loophole in there that allows them to actually use that money. At the very least, it's not doing anybody any good in the sense that it's not helping someone who was a victim of a crime. It's not even going to law enforcement itself. The 23% category is program cost recovery. I don't even know what that
It
means.
pays for the 12 lawyers that do this work.
Yeah.
The stationary.
So I mean, this is the part. This is in action. What we were talking about before is once you establish this, you then grow and grow and grow the number of people who are then relying on it for a job and who then have an incentive to perpetuate it, to grow it, keep it going forward.
In a sense, that could almost be a subcategory of grants to law enforcement.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, you're probably right.
Yeah, it's really the people in the Attorney General's office
Yeah.
as opposed to the police departments, though.
Okay.
But you're right that if you combine those two categories,
It's for
it's
enforcement of the program.
and it's both people who are going to want to keep the program growing and keep the money coming in because that's why their job exists. So you can guess what category 4 is. You can guess. So victims' compensation. Out of all those millions of dollars, only 1.45 has gone to victims. That's 7.2%. I was really, really shocked when I saw that. I had a sense that there were problems, that not enough was probably going to victims, but that is tiny. And I think it's really, really dishonest for government to then go out and, as they do, say that this is all about compensating victims when so little of it really is going there. So I think they should come clean, and I think this is something that the public should know and does not know, because all they hear is Special Victims Fund, and that sounds great. So there's the whole 9 yards. I'm actually we had a few more slides. Okay, I'm gonna actually just start to wrap it up here because I want to give about 10 minutes for possible questions and discussion. The rest of what I had as far as slides were just some more evidence of some of the uses of the forfeiture money, which would really raise eyebrows. There was one that some money got used for a gala in Ontario, and also some video from the United States, which again, my speaker problem comes into play, but just showing how it's gotten completely out of control there, even more out of control than here, where we've got, in the United States, you've got situations where law enforcement is pulling people over in their cars, and if they just happen to have a lot of cash on them, the United States the law enforcement says, well, sorry, that
happens in this province as well.
Oh, does it?
There's
Okay.
a presumption anything over $10,000 is tainted by crime.
Okay, and then they grab it. So
Yeah.
they take the cash. The person is not charged with anything. The person is not even suspected of anything beyond having too much cash. and then it's up to you to hire a lawyer to try and get it back. So that's basically all you're missing by me wrapping up, is just some more examples of how this ramps up and how out of control it can be. I'll just finish by saying, for the Montagues, for Bruce and Donna Montague, to me, they really are, I think Scott said it was a metaphor for the dangers and the problems, and I think that's right. The Montagues are expecting a grandchild any day now. Katie's due this week, I think. And we are now going to see the difference between whether that grandkid gets to go and see the house where his mom grew up and that his mom helped build, that his grandfather built with his own hands, where they skied and all the lovely family memories that they have, or whether that grandkid is going to have to look at that house in pictures and be told, no, we don't have this anymore because it was taken through forfeiture by the government because of your grandfather's principled opposition to a law he thought was unconstitutional, even after he did jail time for that. I think it's a really sad set of options, but we're going to fight and do everything we can to make sure that it's the happier option that happens. And that's that. And I'm happy to take any more questions or if you have more comments about it.